Well, good morning. Thank you for that long list of things that I've done. But really, hopefully you remember a few other things rather than the long list of things I've done. 20 years ago, Peter Blake began what would become Blake Expeditions. You'll be seeing quite a lot of Tara, his old ship, or yacht, on the news. Blake Expeditions started following an epiphany of Peter's that the future of mankind on this planet was going to be limited by the quality and quantity of water. And that water cycle was integrally linked to the climate cycle. But he took his epiphany a step further. He believed that he could do something about it. In fact, it was self-belief and relentless hard work that drove him to succeed in his long and illustrious yachting career as well. My own experience has some parallels. My 30 years of expeditions to Antarctica began with another rudimentary epiphany, and that was as a first-year university student, that a big cube of ice on the bottom of the planet was not going to be very compatible in a warming world. It had to melt if the world warmed enough. And if it did, where on earth did all that water go? And it's a pretty significant ice cube, 26 quadrillion tonnes. For the mathematicians amongst you, that's 26,000 million tonnes. And that's enough water to raise sea level around the planet by 60 metres. So like Peter, I too realised I needed to do something about my epiphany, about melting ice and rising sea levels. And I've spent a lot of my career trying to fill the knowledge gap regarding climate change and Antarctica's potential influence. And I've been to some amazing places along the way. The South Pole, the Beardmore Glacier that Hillary drove up on his, well, Hillary didn't drive up there, Scott went up there and Hillary went across the top of it to get to the South Pole. Cape Adare at the northern limits of Antarctica, in fact harder to get to than the South Pole these days. The subantarctic islands, when you think of Antarctica and all its wildlife, actually it's mostly the subantarctic that has all the wildlife, not Antarctica itself, it's too cold. And the Southern Ocean that Blakey was famous for sailing through, dodging the icebergs and going through some pretty heavy seas. And I've been as far to another part of the planet, to the Atacama Desert, looking at changing climate as well. So while it sounds amazing, it always does after the successful return, after the new discoveries, after the win at the Olympics, the gold medal. It always sounds amazing afterwards. But the hard work and the hardship to get there often gets forgotten. The long hours of planning, the long hours of training, the long hours of cold. Now, obviously, Antarctica's ice sheets have a great deal of inertia. You might assume that changes there are going to be slow, glacial in fact. But the geological record indicates something a little bit different. Yes, there have been long periods of stability of the ice, and we're in one of those now, but they have been punctuated by rapid ice melt, when sea level rose as fast as 4 metres per 100 years. That's naturally, let alone what we're doing today. The other thing we learned along the way is that the system is pretty sensitive to the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When carbon dioxide levels are low, Antarctic ice sheets appear more stable. When carbon dioxide levels are higher, the ice is less stable. And for a number to remember, it looks like 400 parts per million. That's not very much. Carbon dioxide is a critical threshold in the atmosphere. Above that, the geological record shows smaller ice sheets than today, and sea levels about 10 metres higher. You might want to check how far you are above sea level when you get home. At 500 parts per million of atmospheric CO2, the record shows sea levels more than 20 metres higher. So, as the Earth passed through 400 parts per million CO2 only a couple of years ago, scientists and others were left wondering, when is Antarctica going to catch up? And that is what's dominated my research career. But I put it to you that the risk here isn't in what we actually know already. The risk is in what we don't know. Because we don't know, that knowledge gap and that uncertainty makes it difficult to take action, and it makes it difficult to plan, to cope with it. And of course the challenge is further exacerbated by the fact that Antarctica has this huge potential impact. It's not just a small change, it's global. But challenges, as you know, always seem enormous until someone solves it. Everest was impossible to climb until Hillary got to the top. Now we do it, tens to hundreds of people every day. So that impossible thing is no longer impossible. So with respect to climate change, is it all lost? Can we do anything? We sure need to solve the knowledge gap and understand how this whole system works, but we can act now. We know that greenhouse gas levels are increasing year upon year. It's a pretty obvious graph that shows that behind me. We know that it's our action that is increasing those carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. But they are only increasing by 2% or less than 2% per year. So it's actually not impossible to turn that around. We all need to act on that, but we are not. I'd like to introduce you to a concept that many of you may have come across before, though not had a word to describe it. I'd like to introduce you to agnotology. Agnotology is the cultural or deliberate use of misinformation or the lack of information as an excuse not to act. Not to act on the facts that we already know. We don't want to act on climate change because we believe we will have to give up too much. We can't really make a difference, can we? And maybe the 1% of people who think it's not our fault are right. Someone else has to act, and then we might follow, or at least think about it. What a cop-out. Right from the start of that thinking, the fact that we have to give up a lot is false. We only have to make a 2% difference per year. And you can only sit this one out if you are not part of the problem. And in my career speaking around the world, I have not found anyone who lives a carbon-free lifestyle. We are all part of the problem, so we all need to make a 2% difference. We can't leave it to someone else. And if you want to think about what it is you do that can make a difference, sure, it's driving a car, but it's anything that produces carbon dioxide or methane. If you put coal on your fire at home, that's a lot worse than driving a car. You might want to talk to your parents about that. Heat pumps are great. Red meat produces methane. In fact, eating rice produces methane. Now, I'm not suggesting that you give these things up, but you think about the wasted food that you tip away that used carbon and produced methane in making it. You only need to adjust your habits by 2% a year. And while we're on the subject of agnotology, it's not just about climate change. It's about any time you choose not to act or hide behind the belief that you can't make a difference. Any form of environmental pollution, racism, bullying, it's not okay. My challenge to you this Leadership Week is to act on every little epiphany you have. Don't stand by expecting someone else to take care of it. Don't hide behind the crowd, but act on fact, not on fiction or misinformation. Work hard to find the answers that will eventually help inform change and make a difference for society. There's no such thing as too small an action if it is based on hard work, knowledge, and fact. Thank you.
Now please welcome our next speaker, Mr. Jacob Anderson.
Good morning to you all. I think Gary's painted a nice picture around some of the environmental challenges that we have, and I'd like to tell you guys a little bit about my pathways when I was your age in high school, and then on to some of the opportunities that are available through the Sir Peter Blake Trust, both in high school and at university. So for me, when I was your age, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to study, and then I ended up at Massey here in Palmerston North, originally studying to be a vet, and things changed, and then I studied geology instead, and I'd finished my Bachelor of Science, and I sat my final exam of my Bachelor of Science in Christchurch, 21-year-old, so only 3 years. For some of you are 17 or 18, I was only 3 years away from going to Antarctica. And so that was a really special thing for me. It was my first experience down in Antarctica. And the amazing thing about Antarctica is that it's actually right in our backyard. When a cold southerly comes, we can really feel it. And so it's not this cube of ice that's kind of disconnected from New Zealand, and the Southern Ocean is that gateway between us and New Zealand, and it's actually quite easy to get there compared to the sub-Antarctic, as Gary had mentioned. So you fly down on a US Air Force C-17, it takes 5 hours, fly down and land on the sea ice here, and the funny thing is the American program has 1,000 people in the summer compared to about 100 in New Zealand, but they have these enormous trucks with giant wheels, and they pick all of the Americans up, and then New Zealand show up in a Toyota Hilux. So this is how it looks when you fly down. These planes, you can strip the interior out. They give you a bag of lunch and say, have fun. They can put helicopters, all sorts of cargo in. So it's not like a nice Air New Zealand flight by any means. But you get down there and you end up at Scott Base. It's this amazing facility. It's kind of like the opposite of a freezer. And you do a couple of days of field training to start to familiarise yourself before, as scientists, what we do is we go out into the mountains to these remote sites and go camping and collecting samples and data to try and monitor and understand what's happening in Antarctica and how has that been changing through time, and also what that might mean for the future as we continue to heat up the world. So I've also been to some of these incredible places in Antarctica, camping at 1,200 metres on the top of glaciers for several weeks at a time, and 24 hours of sunlight, obviously, through the summer. So it's a very different and unique landscape, and working in small teams can be very challenging in these sorts of environments, so it's really important to be conscious of the team that you work around and really work together effectively. And there's a lot of hazards and risks. And there was an interesting, when I was first training, we had these snowmobiles connected by ropes, and we had to be really careful when we were travelling across the glaciers not to fall down any crevasses. And when I was probably 3 days into my first Antarctic experience and still very nervous and not confident, and I had driven the snowmobile over this rope and completely destroyed the rope. And Gary said to me, "That's why we do the training." And I was immediately relaxed again. It reminded me why we do these trainings and why we make sure we get it right the first time, so then we can continue to do it over and over without making those mistakes anymore. And I think it's an important thing to reflect on. Generally, a lot of people are reluctant to try things or challenge themselves in a way that isn't actually that dangerous. The example I like to think of is we happily would get our phone out and text and drive, which is really dangerous. We could crash and have an accident. But we have this fear of doing things like public speaking or trying a new field of study or a new sport or something that we're not comfortable with. But there's absolutely no risk involved. You can try something and you'll be completely fine afterwards, and there's no sort of consequences. Yet we have this fear of doing those things and no fear of doing things that actually have a risk. So this is another site, 1900 metres, extremely cold, and all of these photos that I've shown you are usually really nice, pretty and picturesque, but sometimes this is when you really get into a challenging environment. This was minus 50 degrees. We got caught in a blizzard. So this field season we were camping for 20 days, and over half of that time we were stuck in the tents or in the containers. So those few days when you're stuck inside, you really have to work effectively in a team. You're in this remote environment. You can't get away from each other, and that's where teamwork is a crucial thing, and being able to get along with your peers and have a great team to work around and trust everyone that you work alongside. And what inspired me to go to Antarctica in the first place was a number of things, but one of them was Peter Blake, this true Kiwi hero who just rolled his sleeves up and got on with it in a number of ways. And he'd spent years working extremely hard, sailing around the world, and it took him several decades to achieve some of those goals. And these aren't things that you can sort of do overnight. You've got to work for years and years and really want them if you want to achieve some of the big and ambitious goals to be the best or to be successful. And so Peter spent several years sailing around the world, and he competed in the Whitbread around the world race 4 times. On his fifth attempt, he finally won. He won all 11 legs, which that record still stands today. So this is the now called the Volvo around the world race. And then obviously what he's better known for is the America's Cup, which he then went on to win in 95 and in 2000, and then heroically we've just won it back this last week for the first time since 2000 as well. And of course, what we want to celebrate in Leadership Week is that true Kiwi spirit and that true leadership style that Peter had. And so that's what the Red Sox represent today, and that's what makes it so special. And when you put those Red Sox on, it's about thinking about what does your leadership style look like, and they all are very different. There's no right or wrong way to do it, and there's leaders who come from the front and people who can kind of lead in the small team from the back. And be loud or also very quiet. There's a number of ways to do it, and it can be trained too. You shouldn't think that a leader is someone who stands at the front or is kind of taking everyone with them. There's a number of ways to express your own leadership style. So I think you should think about that, and it's a skill you can work on just as any other subject in school or any other skill that you're good at. Peter spent these years sailing around the world, and he noticed things were changing. He noticed this decline in the large albatross in the Southern Ocean and these sensitive parts of the world. And so that's when he shifted his attention to Blake expeditions in that last year of his life. He was about to begin a 5-year odyssey through Antarctica, the Amazon, and then unfortunately he was killed, but he was then to go up to the Arctic and then into the Pacific. But the amazing thing was he was a real forward thinker. He was thinking about these things 20 years before they were kind of normal, or what we talk about today, he was talking about 20 years ago. So he was really ahead of his time in that sense. But unfortunately it was cut short. And so what I would like to touch on now is what the trusts do to continue Peter's legacy and some of those opportunities that you guys can get involved with. And Ben Piggott was one of the students from Boys High who's been on our expeditions and been on our programs before. But each year we run a Youth Enviro Leaders Forum between Term 1 and Term 2 for Year 11 to Year 13 students. So there's 60 students selected from all over New Zealand. And so that's a fully funded course. There's no cost for you or the school, and a student from one student from each school will be flown to the certain region of that year. For example, it's been in Rotorua last year, or this year is in Auckland. We've also been in Nelson, and there's a different focus each year on climate or fresh water quality or biodiversity, ocean health. There's a number of different topics and it changes each year, but it's an adventure-packed week full of adventures, but also learning from leading scientists, leading experts in their field. And so it's sort of an amazing experiential field trip throughout the week. And the other great thing is students who are part of our Youth Enviro Leaders Forum then have the opportunity to join us on a Navy vessel on a Young Blake expedition, so continuing Peter's legacy through exploration and understanding what some of these environmental pulse points or sensitive parts of New Zealand look like and how they're changing. So far we've had one expedition up to the Kermadec, halfway up to Tonga, in between New Zealand and Tonga, and 2 to the subantarctic Auckland Islands. So this was one from the Kermadec, where it's sort of a subtropical, tropical environment, and every expedition that's been up there in recent years, they've discovered new species. As well as that, we've spent this time in the subantarctic, a very unique place, and sort of more biodiversity there than there is in Antarctica. And it's one of the last places on Earth where trees can grow, and it really is a completely unique place. And while it is part of New Zealand, in these islands 400 kilometres south of Bluff, they look nothing like you can imagine in New Zealand or nothing like Fiordland. And then beyond that, once you guys start thinking about after high school, there's other opportunities called the Blake Ambassador Program, where we send students to Antarctica themselves to work with the Heritage Trust and restore huts, working with Antarctica New Zealand on engineering projects such as installation of the wind turbines, and a number of other opportunities in Antarctica. There's also conservation programs that we do with DOC all over New Zealand, where that be working with endangered species or mobilising a team to try and eradicate the pests and work towards New Zealand's goal of being predator-free by 2050. So some of these have been on offshore islands, and others have been in the mainland, working in various national parks on some of New Zealand's most unique and interesting species. And as well as that, we've got a partnership with NIWA. So NIWA is New Zealand's National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research. So we have students working on oceanographic voyages. These have been looking at fisheries throughout the Chatham Rise or in the Southern Ocean and down into the Ross Sea, and also monitoring humpback whales in the Ross Sea. As well as that, we've had other projects working on fresh water. So immediately after the Kaikoura earthquake, we had an ambassador working with the team in Christchurch and Canterbury on some of the changes after the Christchurch earthquake around farms and fresh water, as well as climate and atmospheric monitoring through Central Otago. So there's a real number of different amazing opportunities and projects. And the other thing is, while a lot of the students that we take on board are scientists, they're not all scientists, and we want students from every walk of life. We want people who are working in business, we want people working in a number of fields to be thinking about some of these big sustainability and environmental challenges, and that's going to become the framework, I think, of almost all business in the future. And so how we effectively operate within this planet in a sustainable manner through all of our businesses and companies and the way we live through food and agriculture and primary industries is so important. And I think that having a knowledge of that is going to become even more important in the future. And so I want to kind of leave you with this quote from Peter, one of in his last log entry on board Seamaster before he was killed. And he said, "To win, you have to believe you can do it. You have to be passionate about it. You have to really want the result, even if this means years of work. We want to restart people caring for the environment, and at the same time, we want to do this through adventure, through participation, through education, and through enjoyment. The hardest part of any big project is to begin. We have begun. We are underway. We have a passion. We want to make a difference. We hope that you and as many of your friends will join us." And so that's the mantra, really. You've got to pull your sleeves up and get on with it. If you really want something, no one else is going to do it except you. So if there's something that you want to do, you've got to get stuck in, and it could take years of work, but believe me, it's worth it, guys, if you really want it. So I want to just leave you with that. That's what it's called. GELF is one of our Youth Enviro Leaders Forum. So the applications will be opening early next year. And if any of you are interested, visit our website and follow us on Facebook and Instagram to get the updates and all the information. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank Professor Wilson and Mr. Anderson for coming in today and educating us about the Sir Peter Blake Trust, as well as some insight into agnotology. That's definitely the first time I've heard about it this morning. And also sharing your personal experiences at Scott Base and the challenges you faced during your journeys with us today. So I hope you accept these small gifts as a token of our appreciation.